as I've tried to say for, I don't know, nearly 40 years, that we have to put nature back at the center of...
The British monarchy has survived wars, scandals, abdications, and betrayals, but insiders say this moment may be one of its most uncomfortable yet. Behind the gates of Buckingham Palace, whispers have grown louder about a decision King Charles never expected to face so openly. A decision that doesn't involve politics or protocol but family. On one side stands Prince William, the future king, carrying the weight of the crown's survival and the public's trust. On the other stands Queen Camilla, the woman Charles fought decades to make his wife, now firmly seated at the heart of the monarchy. Sources claim tensions that were once quietly managed behind closed doors are no longer so easy to contain. Advisors are reportedly split, courtiers are nervous, and palace staff say the atmosphere has shifted in a way they haven't felt in years. At the center of it all is King Charles, caught between his role as a father and his loyalty as a husband. What makes this situation explosive isn't just who is involved, but what is at stake. The future direction of the monarchy, public perception, and the fragile balance of power inside the royal household. Some believe Charles's response has already sent shockwaves through palace walls, quietly signaling where his priorities truly lied at. So what forced this moment of reckoning? What choice did King Charles make behind closed doors, and why did it leave royal insiders stunned? And most importantly, how could this decision reshape the monarchy's future far sooner than anyone expected? Inside Buckingham Palace, loyalty has always been currency. It determines influence, access, and ultimately power. But according to royal insiders, the balance of that loyalty has become increasingly difficult for King Charles to maintain. As the monarchy enters a delicate new era, the tension isn't erupting in public arguments or official statements. Instead, it's unfolding in subtle decisions, quiet exclusions, and strategic positioning behind the scenes. At the heart of this growing strain is Prince William's expanding role. As heir to the throne, William has been steadily stepping into responsibilities that once belonged exclusively to his father. With each public appearance, foreign tour, and high-profile initiative, he is being presented as the monarchy's future, not a distant one, but an approaching reality. Insiders say this shift has created unease within certain corners of the royal household, particularly among those who feel their influence could diminish as William's authority grows. Queen Camilla, long viewed as Charles's most trusted confidant, is said to be especially protective of her position. After decades of public criticism and personal sacrifice, she finally occupies the role she once believed might never be fully accepted. Those close to her claim she sees William's assertiveness not as a threat but as a force that must be carefully managed. Others, however, suggest that her behind-the-scenes involvement has occasionally crossed into territory that makes palace staff uncomfortable. William, by contrast, is described as far more reserved but not passive. Sources say he has grown increasingly focused on modernizing the monarchy, streamlining operations, and distancing the institution from anything that could revive old controversies. This includes a heightened sensitivity to public optics and internal discipline. According to insiders, William has quietly voiced concerns about how certain dynamics within the palace could undermine long-term public trust, concerns that inevitably place him on a different wavelength from Camilla's more traditional approach. Caught between them is King Charles. For years, he has relied on Camilla as his emotional anchor and most reliable advisor. She knows his routines, his temperaments, and his private doubts better than almost anyone. Yet William is not only his son, he is the future monarch, whose success will ultimately define Charles's legacy. Palace observers say this dual loyalty has placed the king in an impossible position, forcing him to make choices that can no longer satisfy everyone. One former court aide described the situation as a slow-burn conflict, noting that the real drama lies not in confrontation, but in omission. Invitations quietly altered, meetings reassigned, decisions delayed or fast-tracked without explanation. Each small move sends a message, and those messages are being carefully watched. What truly intensified the situation, according to insiders, was a series of internal disagreements over representation and influence. Who speaks for the crown during sensitive moments? Who has the king's ear when major decisions are being shaped? And who sets the tone for the monarchy's next decade? These questions have no official answers, but they are being debated daily behind palace doors. Eventually, the pressure reached a point where neutrality was no longer possible. Advisors began urging King Charles to clarify boundaries and signal stability both to the public and to those working within the institution. Silence, they warned, would only fuel speculation and fracture internal trust. It was in this climate that Charles made a decision, one subtle enough to avoid headlines, yet clear enough to be felt throughout the palace. A decision that suggested where authority would flow going forward, and whose vision would quietly take precedence. The shift became noticeable not through dramatic announcements, but through absence. Royal watchers began to observe subtle changes in who appeared beside the king, who was consulted on key matters, and whose priorities were reflected in official schedules. Insiders say this was no coincidence. It was the quiet result of King Charles finally drawing a line, even if he never openly acknowledged it. According to palace sources, Charles chose continuity over comfort, while his personal bond with Camilla remained unchanged. His institutional alignment began to tilt more visibly toward Prince William's long-term vision. This wasn't a rejection of his wife, but it was a recalibration, one that signaled where the monarchy's future authority would rest. For those inside the palace, it felt like a turning point. William's influence reportedly expanded in areas that mattered most: strategic planning, public messaging, and decisions tied to the monarchy's image among younger generations. Meetings once handled quietly by senior courtiers loyal to Camilla were now increasingly routed through William's team. Some advisors saw this as inevitable. Others viewed it as a silent demotion of long-standing power structures. Camilla, insiders say, noticed immediately. Those close to the Queen describe her reaction as controlled but unmistakably tense. Having spent years defending her role and legitimacy, she was now watching the center of gravity shift away from her orbit. Publicly, she maintained composure, appearing dutiful, supportive, and unshaken. Privately, however, sources suggest she felt blindsided by how decisively the palace tone had changed. What stunned many insiders wasn't that Charles leaned toward William, it was how firmly he did so once the choice became unavoidable. Staff members describe a king who appeared weary of internal friction and increasingly conscious of how history would judge his reign. One aide reportedly remarked that Charles didn't want to be remembered as the bridge that collapsed, but the one that held. The decision also had immediate ripple effects. Longtime aides known to be closely aligned with Camilla reportedly found their access reduced. Meanwhile, figures associated with William's modernization efforts gained visibility and momentum. These weren't dismissals or public reshuffles, but in palace culture, influence matters more than titles. To outside observers, everything looked normal. Smiles at engagements, coordinated appearances, carefully worded briefings. But inside the palace, the atmosphere was described as strained and watchful. Every interaction was analyzed, every seating arrangement scrutinized. Silence itself became a message. William, for his part, did not publicly celebrate or assert dominance. Sources say he remained deliberately restrained, aware that overt moves could provoke backlash or deepen divides. His strategy, insiders claim, was patience, allowing the institutional shift to speak for itself. That restraint, paradoxically, strengthened his position even further. Charles's choice also reflected a hard truth about monarchy: sentiment cannot override succession. While Camilla may be the present, William is the future, and the crown, above all else, is designed to endure beyond personal loyalties. Palace historians quietly note that similar moments have defined previous reigns, even if they were never openly acknowledged at the time or still. The emotional cost should not be underestimated. Friends of the king suggest the decision weighed heavily on him. Balancing duty and devotion has been a lifelong struggle for Charles, and this moment forced him to confront it once again, this time with the eyes of history watching closely. The palace, however, had little time to process the internal fallout, because beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace, speculation was already growing. Commentators sensed a shift, rumors intensified, and questions began circulating about what this change would mean not just for family dynamics, but for the monarchy itself. And as the outside world started to notice, the consequences of Charles's choice were about to become far more visible than anyone inside the palace expected. As whispers from inside the palace began leaking into public conversation, the royal household entered a phase of quiet damage control. Officials didn't deny anything outright, but they didn't clarify either. That silence only amplified curiosity. Royal commentators started noting changes in body language, phrasing, and positioning during engagements, reading between lines that were never meant to be are. Behind the scenes, the palace communications team worked overtime to ensure unity remained the dominant narrative. Any hint of discord had to be softened, reframed, or buried beneath tradition and ceremony. Yet even the most polished image couldn't fully mask the underlying tension. Queen Camilla's role, while still visible and respected, seemed more contained. She continued with her patronages and duties, but her presence in strategic moments appeared reduced. Sources stress this was not punitive but symbolic, a quiet acknowledgement that while her place beside the king was secure, her influence over the monarchy's future direction was no longer paramount. This recalibration sent a powerful message across royal circles. It reassured traditionalists who feared instability, while signaling to reform-minded observers that evolution was underway. William was no longer waiting in the wings, he was actively shaping the institution he would one day inherit, and crucially, he was doing so with his father's tacit approval. Yet not everyone welcomed this shift. Some senior figures worried it moved too quickly, risking alienation of long-standing allies loyal to Camilla. Others feared it set a precedent, suggesting that emotional bonds could be sidelined when strategic necessity demanded it. The monarchy has always thrived on balance, and this recalibration tested that equilibrium. For King Charles, the public scrutiny was relentless. Every gesture toward William was analyzed as confirmation. Every moment beside Camilla was dissected for reassurance. Insiders say the king became increasingly careful, aware that even unintended signals could fuel speculation. His solution, according to aides, was consistency, maintaining visible unity while allowing the internal structure to evolve quietly. William's response to the growing attention was notable for what it lacked: triumph. Those close to him say he viewed the situation not as a victory, but as a responsibility. The weight of expectation intensified, and with it, the pressure to deliver stability in uncertain times. Any misstep now would be magnified not just as a personal failure, but as a reflection of his future reign. Meanwhile, Camilla's inner circle reportedly urged restraint. They understood that open resistance would only harden perceptions and risk public backlash. Instead, the strategy was patience, trusting that her long-standing loyalty and service would remain undeniable, regardless of shifting dynamics. But even patience has limits. Behind palace doors, conversations grew more guarded. Longtime routines changed. Familiar confidences were reconsidered. The monarchy, once a tightly woven family unit at its core, now felt more institutional than personal. Necessary, perhaps, but undeniably colder. As one insider quietly put it, "This is what transition looks like. It's never gentle." And as the dust settled internally, a larger question began to loom, one that extended beyond Charles, William, or Camilla as individuals. By the time the palace settled into its new rhythm, the message was clear, even if it was never officially spoken. King Charles had made his choice not with words, but with direction. The monarchy would move forward with Prince William at its center, not as a distant heir, but as an active architect of what comes next. For many inside the royal system, this was the clearest signal, yet, that the transition era had quietly begun. Historians of the crown often note that the most consequential royal decisions are rarely announced. They are felt, and this decision was felt in how authority flowed, how trust was distributed, and how the future was being shaped in real time. Charles did not cast aside Camilla, nor did he diminish her public standing. Instead, he placed boundaries around influence, drawing a distinction between emotional partnership and institutional leadership. For Queen Camilla, this moment marked a complicated evolution. Her journey to the throne had been long, painful, and fiercely contested. Becoming queen was never about power alone, it was about recognition, legitimacy, and survival. And while her place beside the king remained intact, the era of quiet dominance behind the scenes appeared to be over. Insiders say she understood this reality, even if accepting it came at a personal cost. Prince William, meanwhile, emerged not as a victor, but as a figure burdened by expectation. The palace's shift toward his vision meant that any future instability would rest squarely on his shoulders. Reform could no longer be theoretical. Modernization could no longer be postponed. With influence came accountability, and there would be no one else to quietly absorb the blame. If things went wrong, public reaction to the perceived shift was mixed but telling. Younger audiences responded positively to William's steady, disciplined presence. Traditionalists found reassurance in Charles's adherence to protocol and continuity, and those who had long questioned Camilla's role saw confirmation of a boundary they believed should have existed all along. Even without confirmation, the narrative took hold. Yet perhaps the most revealing aspect of this moment was what it exposed about King Charles himself. For a man whose life had been defined by divided loyalties, duty versus desire, crown versus heart, this choice represented a form of resolution. Not an easy one, not a painless one, but a necessary one. In choosing institutional stability over personal comfort, Charles aligned himself with the very system he spent decades waiting to lead within palace walls. The tension did not vanish overnight. Trust takes time to rebuild. Roles take time to settle. But the uncertainty that once hovered over every decision slowly began to lift. The hierarchy was clearer. The future, while still complex, felt more deliberate. This moment will likely not be remembered for scandal or spectacle. There were no explosive confrontations, no dramatic walkouts, no public ultimatums. Instead, it will be remembered as a quiet pivot, a turning point defined by restraint rather than drama. And yet, its implications may prove far-reaching, because in choosing to empower Prince William at this critical juncture, King Charles may have accelerated a transition that few expected to see so soon. A transition not of title, but of influence, one that subtly reshapes how the monarchy operates, communicates, and survives in a rapidly changing world. The palace may never confirm it. Royal aides may never admit it. But for those watching closely, the conclusion is unavoidable. King Charles did choose, and in doing so, he revealed where the monarchy's future truly lies.